Hello, everybody. Welcome into Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. My name is Brandon Adams. I've got Mike Griffith here, Connor Riley as well, Jeff Sintel on the way momentarily. He's been on assignment throughout the day. We'll talk about everything related to Georgia football over the course of our time together. We'll get into the 10-game schedule for the Dogs that came out on Monday, and how UGA fans are feeling about that. What appears to be a growing controversy between former Georgia offensive lineman Kade Mays, his new home Tennessee, and a very mouthy lawyer. We'll cover all of that before we're done here today as well. But gentlemen, let me begin with this. We are almost a full week into the start of Georgia practices here. Mike Griffith, you live in Athens. You haven't been able to see those practices. Connor, many times you'd be there for all of them, and I would at least be there for some of them. We're not on the scene, as you might expect, with the coronavirus going on right now, but the obligation to learn as much as we can, the opportunity to share that with Georgia fans still exists in this year, just like any other. So, Mike, based on what you've been hearing, the Georgia players that you've spoken to, Kirby Smart, who you heard from a little earlier this week, what do you think you've learned so far through almost one full week of Georgia practices at this point?
I mean, I just think the buy-in, Brandon, you haven't had any Georgia players opt out. I mean, today's the day Georgia was supposed to cut to 85 scholarships. And, we don't know how they did it. We don't know if there's anybody in the transfer portal. I guess we're all going to kind of be on pins and needles to see how Georgia got rid of those 2 or 3 guys. Or maybe we won't know. Maybe that'll happen quietly. Somebody will go off scholarship and pay their own way, and we won't know. But I think just the level of buy-in and the chemistry, you're seeing all these issues at Florida and Vanderbilt and on these other campuses. And it just seems like Georgia players are really bought in, very excited. And, according to Kearis Jackson, this offense is moving fast with everybody in the right spot. So sounds like an optimal start to me.
Yeah, Mike, I think that's a really interesting point. On Dog Nation Daily this week, I made the comparison at Florida, where you had 3 top receivers not practice on Monday, still tweeting about playing in games, yet not showing up for practice. Unknown situation with one of the top defensive linemen, Zachary Carter. And listen, if a player wants to sit out for a reason related to the coronavirus, if he's not comfortable, I totally support him in that situation. But it's the 1 foot in, 1 foot out world that I think if you're a football coach, you would probably find that pretty distasteful. And the fact that Georgia, at least at this point in time, is not dealing with any of that kind of stuff, I do think is good news. Now, Mike, the other thing I've said is, just given how weird this year has been, there's always a chance that storyline takes a turn for the worse at some point in time. But while it's not true, I'm going to reserve the right to make fun of Dan Mullen for what he's dealing with, and frankly celebrate the fact that my favorite team, Georgia's not dealing with that kind of stuff, at least for the moment.
Yeah, you got to get your shots in while you can. I mean, it's the SEC after all, and Georgia certainly ends up getting their fair share from other schools. You mentioned, well, I guess I'll wait till you get to it on the show. But as far as the fall practices go, we didn't really see a whole lot before anyway. We would look at them throw the ball and catch it in some skeleton drills, but it's not like we ever saw real live football. And,
yeah.
and gosh, Matt Landers looks great, until the lights come on and there's 11 guys on the other side of the ball. We'll see. I mean, we're going to hear in a couple of weeks how Matt Landers is adjusted or not adjusted.
Connor, how about for you? What have you learned? You follow this as closely as anyone does. What have you learned through 1 week thus far?
Oh, come on,
Mike. Why are you wearing a tie?
Because not only am I going to dominate you guys in a debate, I also want to look good doing it. Look good, debate good. It's all, elementary stuff here.
Sure,
so, Mike, you don't need to hold the card so close to the chest. You know who's going to be the starting quarterback, who's impressing at practice. You don't know all that. No, I think Mike hit on it. Traditionally, we don't necessarily glean a lot from these practices based off just what the availability is for us to watch. I think Mike really hit on it with Kearis Jackson and sort of taking it a step further. The offensive linemen, all of them, Warren Erickson, Trey Hill, Jamari Sawyer, who we've all spoken to this week, have all made it a point to say, yeah, we want to play faster, specifically with the offensive line. Now, what does that mean? I think we've seen these guys slim down, lose some weight, and my internet connection is unstable. Fantastic.
Well, we can hear you for right now. At least I can. So hopefully,
fantastic. Cool.
Hopefully, it remains true on that. But finish the point you're making on the offensive line there.
Yeah, they're all sort of slimmed down, or at least certainly Jamari Sawyer and Trey Hill are to this point. And I think what that means going forward is you're going to see maybe less of the bully ball type things that you saw in years past, and maybe a little bit more, especially when it comes to that offensive line, and athletic and trying to play side to side, as well as, most importantly, I think taking those vertical shots downfield.
Yeah, before I share my own thought about what I feel like I've learned, Mike, would you mind responding to Connor on that? Because this is confirmation of what we assume to be true. And listen, a lot of times blowhards like me that speak into a microphone for a living, what we assume to be true ends up not being true. That, well, Matt Luke's going to usher in more athletic offensive linemen, They're going to look to get slimmer at that position. We've had some recruits that have kind of foreshadowed that. But lo and behold, when Salyer says what he says, when Warren Erickson says what he said, when Trey Hill says what he said, all of a sudden I think you've got a pretty substantial confirmation that, yeah, these guys do want to play a little more athletic brand of football along the offensive line. They don't want to just, sort of maul you the way that maybe the Sam Pittman lines wanted to. Not that didn't always work. There were times when it worked to great effect for Georgia. But it seems pretty clear with Matt Luke as line coach for the Todd Monken offense, this group's going to go in a different direction.
Well, that's one of the characteristics of the air raid offense is wider line splints and more athletic offensive linemen. You want to create those passing lanes by spreading your offensive linemen out. And you also want to make it a little bit harder for those edge rushers to get to your quarterback when you spread things out. So if you're going to have wider line splints, then you need to have more athletic guys, quicker guys. And I think that'll serve Georgia well. Also helps out with the perimeter run game. A lot of people in the past have said, how come they don't run it outside? Well, the big guys at 330, 340 don't move real well. I mean, Ben Cleveland's not the fastest guy on the team. Pulling or Solomon Kinley. I mean, good quickness is not the same as good speed into the flats. So I think now you're going to have a little bit lighter, quicker, faster guys. And wasn't it interesting that Warren Erickson was the guy that came out and talked to the media, a redshirt sophomore, instead of a fifth-year senior in Ben Cleveland?
Yeah, certainly Erickson tabbed in that regard. He did start in the Sugar Bowl. Mike, did you read something into that?
Always read into who Kirby sends out and who he doesn't send out. I mean, he doesn't give us much to go on, but it's usually a pretty good gauge. But on the other hand, Kade Mays had more media appearances last year than Jake Fromm. So go figure. Who knew that it was living in such a toxic environment?
By the way, I promise we'll get there before we're done today. Christopher White, Petey Wheatstraw, and others really remarking, Connor, you've set the bar high for how you're dressed. I will point out that I have my Dog Nation shirt and gym shorts with socks underneath here. So I'm not exactly matching your level of sartorial splendor at the moment.
I'm just trying to bring everyone up, and hopefully next week, by the end of the season, when Georgia's 9-1, playing in the SEC championship game against Alabama, hopefully we're all doing these in suits and ties.
Yeah, I like the idea of that. Here's what I can promise you: I will do the show in top hat and tails if Georgia's 9-1. I'll come in here with a monocle. I'll look like the Monopoly man doing the show if Georgia can get to 9-1. No problem with that whatsoever. But let me tell you, both of you, what I think the thing that at least I feel like I've learned the most thus far, and I want a response from both of you on this. Listen, I make no bones about my agenda. I do believe that for Georgia to win a national championship, they've got to upgrade offensively. I think they've got to be more dynamic, more explosive plays. I think that Todd Monken's arrival is a part of that. And I think right now, what Monken knows is not as important as how well he instructs. In other words, can he impart that knowledge into Georgia players that are much younger than the guys that he's been used to dealing with the last couple of years in the NFL? Of course, Monken has been in college football prior to that. And you listen to Jamari Salyer talk this week. You listen to Kearis Jackson talk this week. You listen to Warren Erickson talk this week. I thought there were really three examples, each from one of those guys, of, hey, feeling comfortable with the way in which that Monken is instructing right now. I love something that Jamari Salyer said in particular. I don't want to read too much into one sentence, but he said that he thought that Monken was doing a good job of keeping things simple for them at the moment. Connor, for me, that's just really, really important because I don't think the absence of spring practice or the weirdness of the offseason is an excuse for Georgia not becoming what it needs to become offensively. And the fact that Monken is drawing some reviews right now to the positive for how well he's instructed makes me as a fan feel better that we might actually see a different looking offense on the field this upcoming fall.
Right. Everyone is sort of having to deal with these off-season changes. And I think just because Oklahoma, for example, didn't have a spring practice and is going through the weirdness of this 2020 season, they're still going to have one of the best offenses in the country this year because that's just what we've come to expect from Lincoln Riley and the way he coordinates and designs and game plans offensive football. And I think I'm sort of excited to see what Todd Monken does with that. In the clip you played today about him talking about teaching more, you hear Kirby this week talking about how these next sort of 25, or I guess now it's 22-ish practices, are a real chance to develop guys and teach guys and instruct them to get better instead of necessarily straightforward game planning. And yes, they didn't have the chance to do that in the spring and a weird truncated summer in that circumstance. But I do think that Monken is really, based off what he's previously said, and I think the adjustment of coming back to the college game, teaching and helping guys get better I think is a big part of why he is at Georgia right now.
Mike, you understand where I'm coming from on this? I love the idea of Monken as an instructor, and at least on the basis of some of what we heard, it sounds like he enjoys that. It sounds like the Georgia players are also enjoying it themselves thus far.
Yeah, so far so good. A lot of the teaching took place over the summer. Now it's taking those lessons from the Zoom and the classroom and trying to apply it on the football field. See who can actually execute it. I mean, it's great that they know the plays. It's great that they know the routes to run, but how crisp are they? How well are they executing? Those are the things right now that Todd Monken is really drilling down deep, because those are the things that make a difference. I mean, that's why the LSU passing game and the Alabama passing game was so effective, because their guys ran the wrong routes. Unlike Georgia guys that sometimes turned the wrong way, dropped the ball, or ran too shallow or too deep, and everybody went, Jake Fromm underthrew that guy. No, actually, he ran the wrong depth. So what's happening right now as far as getting everybody disciplined, finding out who can really execute it, and then they're going to move forward, because if you can't play, then you're going to be on the sidelines this year. Last year, they had to play those guys because there were so many injuries. This year in that receiver room, BA, you got to be dialed in if you're going to get on the field.
Let me ask you a question. This is not a debate topic. I don't think it's, rise to that level. But when you say they've been learning a lot of this throughout the, off season, the Zoom meetings, I would say to a degree that's true. But I feel like if I'm an offensive player, there's only so much I'm going to learn on a video teleconference. I don't care how much, and I know you, Mike, you asked some Georgia players about that this week, but I don't care how much, you're trying to impart on you, and I don't care how, much they try to take it seriously. I feel like if I was a player, I'm only learning on the practice field. Put your hands on me, put me where you want me to be, show me what to do, trying to do it via video teleconference. I just think that's a poor substitute for the real thing. And I'm assuming, and maybe I'm wrong to assume this, but I'm assuming there's a much faster learning process taking place during these practices right now than the entirety of the offseason, where the conversations in a lot of ways were not all that different than what we're doing right now.
Yeah, probably. I think the terminology is the big thing, BA, and the new route trees, and just kind of understanding, maybe conceptualizing, what you're going to be doing. I mean, it always helps to kind of know, the game plan. You send out our cover 4 plan an hour before, and Connor and I can kind of dig into our playbook and say, all right, how are we going to attack these different subjects? But in all seriousness, the terminology, it's a brand new terminology. It's a brand new playbook. So it was really important that those guys did try to get the most out of the Zoom. And that's something Karis Jackson said. He said, look, I'm not a fan of this, but that's all we had. Yeah. And so we had to really focus and get locked in, because if it's the first day of practice and you don't know the play calls or you don't know the audibles, you're behind, and it's going to be hard to catch up with all the talent Georgia has.
Connor, how about a final thought from you on this topic before we move on?
I think Mike's point about what Kiera said, it really just hammers it home. Ideally, and me personally, I learn by doing. I would not do very well with learning through Zoom, especially when it comes to educational stuff. Talking to my sister yesterday, who's a senior at Georgia, there's part of her that's obviously nervous with everything that's going on there, but she also admits that she wants to be in classes because she just naturally learns better through doing that way. But she's also recognizing, and I think the Georgia players do as well here, that you have to make do with the situation. And this situation was trying to learn a lot through Zoom. And while it might not all necessarily retain 100%, you still have to make the effort to learn as much as you possibly can through Zoom, because the teams that do that the best are going to start the season the best.
Let me say just one more thing before we move on. And I know I already said we were moving on, but let me just do this real quick, because I was watching our feed on Facebook and YouTube. Those photos of Jamie Newman, that's something else that I feel like we've learned this week. That young man looks really impressive. That physique, the video of him throwing the football, you can't really tell much about that other than the fact that he, as has been reported, has a very strong arm. But you don't get a physique like that by accident. God gave that young man an impressive, physical abilities, things like that. But the level of definition that he's developed from a muscular standpoint, you don't get that without putting some real work in. And I'm assuming if he's working that hard on his body, my assumption is Newman's probably working that hard on everything else too.
I think that's a fair assumption, yeah. Go ahead, Connor.
I would just say the recent history of Georgia quarterbacks, at least the past decade, other than maybe Jacob Eason, and I guess you have to include Justin Fields in there as well, though we didn't necessarily see a whole lot of him that first year that he was here. Newman is easily right up there as the most physically impressive guy that Georgia has potentially had at that position in the past decade, I would say.
Yeah, Mike, what were you about to say a moment ago?
I was going to say Felipe Franks, since I heard he's benching almost 400 pounds, B. I don't want you to get too nervous.
No, come on. No. Felipe Franks does not look the way that Jamie Newman does. I mean, it's one thing to be strong. It's another thing to have that like pro wrestler kind of, muscular definition where the tricep kind of sticks out. That's a totally different thing. Felipe Franks wishes he has that. If Felipe Franks had that, he wouldn't be in Fayetteville, Arkansas right now trying to find a new team.
That poor guy. If they put a bench press on the field, Newman will have a great season. Seriously though, he's got to be able to throw that intermediate pass, and he's got to be able to do the pre-snap reads and go through the progression. Listen, that's why he's at Georgia. He came to Georgia to learn a pro-style offense. Now he's going to run some RPOs. He's going to be able to extend some plays with his legs. And yes, he can throw the deep ball. But, as Aaron Murray said, I mean, there's still some areas where Jamie's got to work on that intermediate pass, getting through the progressions. Dave Clawson is a pretty good offensive coach at Wake Forest. And I would venture to say that he probably put Jamie Newman in the best position to succeed that he could there. And Wake was the North Carolina State champs last year. They weren't that bad of a football team.
All right, that's Mike Griffith, Connor Riley here too. Jeff Sintel on his way. He's on assignment on the recruiting beat at the moment. It's Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. Good to have you with us tonight. We're here each and every Thursday at 6 p.m. talking about whatever's going on with Georgia football. And as I said before, it's all brought to you by our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau. With offices in nearly every town and county in the state, Georgia Farm Bureau agents live, work, and play in your community and others like it all around our great state, providing support to all Georgia communities through important local agricultural programs and by offering affordable home, auto, and life insurance protection. Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team. You can find them online at gfbinsurance.com. That website, once again, gfbinsurance.com. All right, let's move on to topic number 2 here on our Cover 4 Live for tonight. The 10-game SEC-only schedule for UGA came out on Monday. Pretty front-loaded for the most part. Difficult game against Auburn in week 2, followed by Tennessee. Then on the road at Alabama before going on the road again to Kentucky with obviously the opener on the road at Arkansas. Mike Griffith, if you're a Georgia fan, you look at the schedule, what's your overall feeling on this supposed to be? Okay with the schedule, or if you're a Georgia fan, should you be worried about it?
Yeah, I don't know if, it kind of is what it is. I think it's a tough draw. I think it's the most physical 4-game stretch in the SEC when you consider you got Auburn, Tennessee, Alabama, and Kentucky in succession. I mean, we saw Cole Kubelik rank the offensive lines, and he had Kentucky and Alabama and Tennessee were the 3 best offensive lines in the league. And you got to play them right in a row. Now, the good news is Georgia's got a great defense and defensive front as well. But I don't think it leaves much margin for error when you play those teams. I think it's fair to say that, certainly Alabama and Auburn can beat you if you have a bad day. Tennessee, maybe, Kentucky, depending on who's at quarterback, whereas the back end of the schedule, you finish with Missouri, Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, South Carolina. I mean, boy, that's really downhill. I know South Carolina won last year, but this year's South Carolina team's pretty depleted. And Georgia won't be quite at the same disadvantage with the off week, I don't think. So I didn't think it was a good draw. I thought it was pretty difficult. Other than having to lay up against Arkansas as a warm-up game, I didn't think the SEC office did him any favors.
Well, what it reminded me of a little bit, Mike, I know you covered Tennessee for a long time. For years and years and years, we saw Tennessee play a very front-loaded schedule. Now, on balance, it's not as hard as the one that any SEC team is going to be playing this year because these are all conference games. But when you were playing Florida third Saturday in September, when you're playing Georgia second Saturday in October, you're playing Alabama third Saturday in October. By the time you get to November, all that was left was like Kentucky and Vanderbilt. Historically speaking, Tennessee's just played very front-loaded schedules. For a long time, LSU kind of did a version of that too. Playing Alabama beginning in November. He'd already played Auburn. All that was left prior to Texas A&M coming in this league was to play teams like Arkansas. So we have seen front-loaded schedules in the SEC before. It's not necessarily that, I would say, unique that Georgia's doing this, but the nature of that split between what happens the first 6 games compared to what happens the last 4 games, hard not to notice it though, right?
Yeah, and disappointing because I feel like one of the big advantages Georgia has over the other teams in the league, Connor, is the depth. It seems like these last 2 Novembers, I mean, Georgia's really hitting stride. Other teams, there's going to be attrition on everything, but all teams. But all things being equal, other than Brenton Cox in the SEC title game, all things being equal, Georgia's usually had that backup guy that you plug in. You don't even know he's out, right? Whereas other teams, when they get to their second and third team guys, there's a tremendous drop off. And against the teams Georgia's playing, that really doesn't matter in November. You kind of wish some of those games were on the front end, maybe in between the Alabama, Kentucky. You're in between the Auburn, Tennessee. You slide one of those softer games in there. And BA, one of my big takeaways before I turn this over to Connor, there'd been a lot of talk about how Alabama and Florida had gotten preferential treatment. And I really tried to block that out. I really didn't want to think that the SEC office would favor those. But I did take note. There's 3 teams in the league that don't have back-to-back road games. One of them is Ole Miss. The other 2 are Alabama and Florida.
Connor, how do you think Georgia fans should feel about the schedule?
Well, Mike, the reason they're protecting Ole Miss is because they're protecting your favorite coach, Lane Kiffin. They want to see him do well and succeed.
I love him. Yeah.
I think the important thing, looking at the schedule, I think Mike did a really good job of sort of laying it out and mentioning how tough that October, essentially the month of October stretch is for Georgia, with Auburn, Tennessee at home, and then Alabama and Kentucky on the road. That Florida game is the first game after that bye, November 7th. If Georgia can get to that November 7th date with a 5-1 record, I think that's what you're looking for right there. Yeah. I think that's the sweet spot because as Mike laid out, those last 4 games, Georgia should win all of those by double digits, quite frankly, just on talent and how we've seen Georgia over the course of under Kirby Smart usually get better as the season progresses. It's a tough stretch. Going on the old schedule, wasn't necessarily confident that Georgia was going to beat Alabama to start the season on September 19th when that game was initially set. You can maybe chalk it up to a schedule loss now with having to play Auburn and Tennessee back-to-back there. I think the worry for me, it's not so much win or losing that Alabama game. Georgia's going to do everything it can to win that game, and it very well still could end up doing that. The worry now becomes playing that Kentucky team the week after, because on the old schedule, they were playing Louisiana and Monroe, and that's an easy cupcake win game. Kentucky is not that. Kentucky, even last year, yes, it was a game played in the pouring rain, but Georgia had to earn that victory there. And I think this season, going to Lexington a week after Alabama, whether you win that game against Alabama or lose that game against Alabama, you can't let that result dictate how you play that next week against Kentucky. And that, to me anyway, is one of the most important things to be watching for this upcoming season with the schedule that Georgia has.
Looks like Jeff Sintel's getting ready to join us. We'll welcome into the discussion here in just a moment. And Mike, let me also piggyback on something that Connor said when he came on Dog Nation Daily this week. And I think this is a really good point. If not great news if you're a UGA fan, I think the placement of Alabama on the schedule makes the game more difficult to win, because I do think that you have to be at something close to your best, even though Georgia's a 7.5-point favorite against Auburn, and we'll get one of these point spreads in a moment, but 7.5-point favorite against Auburn, that seems like a lot for me. I think you've got to play well to beat Auburn. Tennessee, I don't think much of this year, but it's not Louisiana Monroe. That's a game where you have to, Georgia had to put its foot on the gas in the second half last season, win that game comfortably. Because of what Georgia does prior to Alabama, I think that game against the Crimson Tide is now more difficult to win.
Yeah, you got to look at the defensive coaches they're up against too. By then Georgia's offensive identity will kind of be out there for everybody to see. I liked Alabama in that opener because maybe you didn't really know as much about Georgia, but now Saban and his staff will be able to sit back and see what Kevin Steele did and see what Jeremy Pruitt did. And those coaches can scheme you up. I mean, those are 2 of the better defensive coaches in the country. And so Saban's going to sit back and he's going to see what's worked against what Georgia and what hasn't. And then Georgia they're going to counter. They're going to do a self-scout. They'll try to change some things up. But I agree with your point. I think it is a more difficult game where it's at on the schedule. The other note, BA, is that, Georgia plays a home game on October 10th, and you're not going to see him in Sanford Stadium again until November 21st. And man, that's the best weather. That's the best time to be outside in Georgia, is that month of October, the beautiful weather. So it's going to be very hot at the beginning and very cold at the end. That's not good for fans. If I was a fan, I wouldn't be real happy, because who wants to go to those games in November anyway? Those are bad teams.
Gosh, if there was only something that Georgia could have done to keep that from happening, I just can't figure out what it possibly would have, what would have been.
I'm leaving that one alone.
On that, though, to push back, and we're not getting into the whole Florida argument there, but there are years in the past where Georgia will have a game, October 10th. They'll have a road game. They'll have the bye week. They'll play in Jacksonville. And in some years, 2018 comes to mind, they were at Kentucky. We've seen them go that, early October to mid-November stretch before of not having a home game. So I don't necessarily know how much that'll impact this Georgia team.
Yeah, that's actually not been all that uncommon for Georgia. That's a good point. Jeff Sintel is joining us here. He's been on the road today, taking care of some news on the recruiting beat. Jeff, we're talking about the Georgia schedule and what the fan reaction to it should be. And I think across the board, most SEC fans feel like their team's playing a tough schedule, because when you're only playing 10 SEC games, you are playing a tough schedule. A lot of folks feel like Georgia got the easy shake on this in some respects, because it gets a cupcake game before the SEC championship, starts the season for the Cupcake game. Some people thought Georgia got treated very kindly because of that. Ultimately, how do you feel Georgia fans should feel about the 10-game schedule, and what in particular about the schedule jumps out to you?
Well, hold on a second. Connor, are you wearing a tie? Hold
Of
on.
course.
Is that really a
look
tie?
good.
All right, man. I guess that's look good, cover for good, right?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
But I actually like the schedule and where it puts the program. I think this is a year, man, we've been doing this for so long now. The 2017 class, the 2018 class, the 2019 class should have prepared this roster for a championship run. I think depth will be there. I think that's what everybody worries about. They're then, oh my gosh, that's that tough game with Auburn, and then another tough game with Tennessee, and then here comes Alabama. The attrition of the early part of the season. I think Georgia's really built for this. I think they've got the personnel and the pieces now, even at the quarterback spot, where they're going to get banged up. The adversity of a season is going to happen. But here's what I really like about it: when I saw Alabama right there after two really good opponents, that is going to give Georgia battle-tested, really good conditions. Kevin Steele, I think he's regarded as the best schemer in the conference for seeing as how what he did last year with LSU and that brilliant offensive squad they had right there. I think any bugs, any wrinkles, any hiccups, anything that needs to be fixed or play faster, play better, play sharper, switching in personnel, out of personnel, I think Georgia will have everything in place to really go at Alabama hard in that game. I'm not worried about the daunting opponents in front of it.
Let me give a couple comments here. Chad Buchanan says he does not like the Kentucky game coming after the Alabama game. Tough road spot after being on the road in Tuscaloosa. Noah Sheldon says he's got Georgia beating Arkansas 48-14 in the season opener. Speaking of those point spreads, Mike, I know you wrote about this DogNation.com here today, but Georgia commonly listed as a 24-point favorite in the season opener at Fayetteville. You're not going to see very many road games in the SEC where the road favorite's bigger number than that. Georgia toted a pretty big number there. David Payne-Purdom, who covers the gambling industry for ESPN a couple of days ago, according to his sources, he's got Auburn, or I should say Georgia listed as a 7.5-point favorite, hosting Auburn on October the 3rd, a 5.5-point underdog going to Tuscaloosa 2 weeks after that, and pretty much the same place the number was around this time a year ago. He's got Georgia as a 3.5-point favorite in Jacksonville against Florida. Gentlemen, any thought on those early point spreads for now?
Arkansas should be higher.
Yeah, that should be a 4-touchdown point spread. I get that it's at Arkansas, but with what home field advantage might or might not be this season, Georgia is not only 24 points better than Arkansas.
Important to note that Alabama's not a much bigger favorite than that on the road at Missouri either. Brett McMurphy citing some stuff from I forget who now. He had Bama as a 27-point favorite at Missouri week 1 as well. So, like I said, when you start getting up much higher than that, you just don't see very many road favorites in the SEC. Even though I don't think Arkansas is good at all, at least in comparison to a game like this. I think they could, beat some lesser competition. But you're just not going to see a much bigger number than that for a road favorite in the SEC. It's just hard to do that.
Yeah, the only thing you just wonder about that first game, guys, is, if it's 24-3 at halftime, and Jamie Newman's played a good game and Kirby's seen what he wants, how much of the offense does he really want Kevin Steele to see? I do think there is something to be said for that.
I think that's a good point. Mike, you also wrote about this, which I think is a good point too. If there was a coach that you're not looking to just hang 100 points on, especially given the murderer's row that he's got coming the rest of the year. Jeff, the idea that Georgia might go a little easier on Pittman week 1 than it would if it was, some dingbat coach in that spot, that seems reasonable to assume for me.
Yeah, but that feels to me like, all the variants about Georgia, new offense, new schemes. Guys, I don't know if that's going to be a buying excuse for me this fall. They've had so much work in install and OTAs and 7-on-7s and preparation. They've got another month before they actually play these games. I think it's 40 days. To me, that feels like a 31-0 type game. That's what it feels like to me, because Arkansas is going to be breaking in everything. I know our good friend Connor will remind everyone on this forum that Arkansas hasn't won too many SEC games lately, and for them to be breaking in a new staff, I just think right now, Mike brings up a good point about showing Kevin Steele anything. Well, in the second half, I think you're going to see a lot of Kenny McIntosh and a lot of Kendall Milton, and I think that's going to be enough to keep that point spread considerably.
You might see Kenny McIntosh in the first half, Jeff. I'll jump in there and make Mike's point for him there. I will say, to offer the contrarian view, obviously you don't want to show all your cards to Kevin Steele, a very good and well-respected defensive coach. But I do think you might see a lot of plays and first-half players or starting players in the second half of that game, just because I think game speed reps is something that Georgia obviously isn't going to be able to replicate even in practices. And I think you, with a new offense and all the newness, especially on that offensive side of the ball, you might want to see and just throw out there and just try and learn as much as you can in that first game for what you might be capable of against a much tougher Auburn defense in that second game.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, but what you got to remember, and, I kind of toyed with you guys about throwing that Kenny McIntosh chum into the water, but you're going to get either Carson Beck or Dwan Mathis or JT Daniels in the second half. You're going to get the chance to see a lot of Jermaine Burton, Darnell Washington, guys like that. I mean, there's no more Cinderella. There are no more cupcakes on these schedules. It's an all SEC season. So you got to build that very good depth in your second and third units. What I want to see, I don't know if we've talked about that, but Mike, do you see travel squads being expanded now during this climate, or do you think everybody will still stick with this 70?
Yeah, I think they'll stick with 70, Jeff. I just think, now that depth is going to be more important than ever because, guys that maybe couldn't get on the bus before, maybe now they get on the bus if there's or the airplane or whatever, if there's if there's some injuries or a COVID outbreak or something like that. But I think 70 is still a good number. And gosh, there's so many different things. My brain wants to go in so many ways. But yeah, I'm going to stay compartmentalized on the question. Yes, Jeff, I think it'll stay at 70.
Let me just say this before we move on too. In talking about who's been impacted by the 10-game conference schedule, I thought this was really interesting. That when Bovada, now there are different season win totals, so not everybody has the same number. But when Bovada came out with its season win total, they had Florida at 7.5, had Georgia at 8.5 on the basis of the 10-game schedule, and the Florida number had the juice on the under, meaning that the gambling public thinks it's more likely that Florida goes 7-3. Then they go 8-2. I've said before that I think that 8-2, now not necessarily for Georgia because Georgia has higher expectations, but I think that 8-2 is a very good season against a 10-game SEC schedule. And at least one example of the gambling public that thinks that Florida's been hurt by adding these 2 additional games, and that all of a sudden 7-3 is a more likely outcome than maybe anything else for the Gators, to give you an idea of just how. I mean, and by the way, on that same gambling website, Tennessee's at 4. They got Tennessee potentially with a losing record. So a lot of teams have really been, I would say, negatively impacted by the addition of these 2 SEC opponents and the fullness of the 10-game conference-only schedule.
I will say, not to make this a Florida show, but going 8-2, for example, means you're beating one of either Georgia, which I don't think anyone here is likely, A&M, I believe, at A&M, and LSU at home. So if Florida does pull off and then they manage to win the other 7 games, that, as BA makes a point, is a good, I think, solid 8-2 season. Now, they won't be happy with that because they actually want to see Florida overtake Georgia. And while we don't think that'll happen, that's the goal there in Gainesville this year.
Hey, real quick final point on this. Rick Joyner mentioned this on Facebook. It's a weird season, but it's still a familiar narrative of Kirby Smart trying to get over the hump against Nick Saban. We don't know how many years that Saban has left. Frankly, I'm not even sure when Georgia would play Alabama again in the regular season. I just don't know. Does the opportunity to beat Saban while he's still a coach at Alabama, does that put more pressure on Kirby in this regular season matchup when you can't be sure you'll get a chance to play him in the SEC championship?
I see what Rick, I believe, is saying there. However, I think these 2 teams are going to see each other in Atlanta, and that's where the pressure really builds and binds for me.
Mike?
Yeah, I do think there's pressure. I do think you want to be that coach to be, what is he, 18-0, 19-0, something ridiculous like that. Let's face it, Kirby's had him twice and let the game get away. You don't want that to be your legacy if you're Kirby Smart. I mean, Paul Bear Bryant never beat Notre Dame. I mean, that's a thorn in the side of every Alabama fan. Still bothers him to this day. So I think this is something that Kirby wants to get done. And obviously, as Connor said, if they do meet back in Atlanta, but I'll tell you what, you look at that schedule again, and, LSU's got a pretty nice road to the SEC title game also.
That's an interesting thing to pay attention to, Mike. Jeff, how about from you? Pressure on Georgia and Kirby in particular to make sure he gets it done on Saban while he still has a chance to?
I think the thing that really matters, I think the thing that really matters is what happens in the first, what happens with the first game, and then how it sets everything up for the second game. I know that sounds very elementary, but nobody's going to remember if Georgia beats Alabama in October, and then they come back and have a round two and advance partners, and they do that in the SEC championship game. So I think that's something that everybody wants to see where they're at compared to the other squad, and then move forward.
Here's what I'll say, and then we'll move on. I think the one thing, if you're Kirby Smart, if you care about legacy, things like that, you don't want Ed Orgeron to beat Saban for a second consecutive year, because then he looks like the Saban killer. For Gus Malzahn to beat Saban again, that'd be 4 wins for him against Saban going back 2013. Gus Malzahn's really kind of had Nick Saban's number. Or if someone like Jimbo Fisher could become the first former Saban assistant to get the head-to-head win, you don't want to give up that mantle of Saban's arch nemesis. And right now, Ed Orgeron's kind of moves Kirby off that spot a little bit. Gus Malzahn doesn't have a lot going for him, it seems at times, but he seems to always find a way to get a win against Saban every now and then. And, obviously, go ahead.
Can you have someone's number when you have a losing record against them?
But Saban's a different kind of coach. You'd acknowledge that, though. To say that you might beat him for a 4th time, Auburn fans probably aren't going to be happy with that, because there hasn't been enough to go along with those wins. But that's not an insignificant accomplishment. I'm
not saying it's not. I just to say that Gus Malzahn has Nick Saban's number when Saban would still have a winning record against Malzahn, I'm just not quite willing to go that far.
Here's what I'll say, though, and we'll move on, because I really don't want this to become an Auburn show.
Are we sure?
Hey, Brandon.
Hold on. Let me make my point here. I'll let you jump back in. There have been specific instances where Malzahn's coaching actually contributed to those wins. Last year is an example of that. 2013 would be an example of that, where Malzahn has actually outcoached Saban, and I don't think you can take that away from him. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I just wanted to interrupt the show with maybe to turn this into a South Carolina show, Brandon. Gunnar Stockton is just committed to South Carolina in the class of 22. I think normally I would have said, if it would have been the other alternative of his top schools, I think you would have forgave me if I would have said, hey, Brandon, pause button. Let's talk about Gunnar Stockton a second. But since I knew since he's going to South Carolina, I didn't want to ruin your point. But so, I figured that's something people need to know.
Jeff, a lot of times we think about recruiting as a way of upending some stories that maybe you don't love. And South Carolina got some awful news on the field today with Marshawn Lloyd, a running back that I really like, suffering an ACL injury. You hate that for him. This will certainly make South Carolina fans feel better for right now. This is, to me, not unsurprising news. Stockton's high school coach is J-Bo Shaw. His brother Connor Shaw, former Gamecocks quarterback, is on the South Carolina staff. I know that, I think you've told us that Stockton and Bobo have had a relationship, that family, going back for a while here. This is not unsurprising news, right?
I think it's going to be interesting, Brandon, how September 11th. Well, let me answer your question first. Number one, I think it's interesting that Gunnar does not wait until the end of the season and sees how the South Carolina staff, how impactful or how tough a season it is for the 2020 season for the Gamecocks in Columbia. A lot of people were wondering if he was going to wait out the season or at least half the season and see what kind of start South Carolina gets, and maybe how extra crispy that seat was going to be there for Will Muschamp going forward in that staff. But he makes a decision. And now what it does to come back around full circle to the September 11th is you'll see Brock Vandegrift and Prince Avenue Christian going up to Raven County to face South Carolina commit Gunnar Stockton in Raven County on September 11th. I mean, it might be a couple years away, maybe 2 or 3, Brandon, but that could be a very big preview of SEC East jostling and some big ball games in the years to come.
Jeff, real quick, it seems appropriate to ask for a recap of Georgia's current relationship with MJ Morris.
I think we just lost Jeff.
So mic drop moment for him. Mike Griffith, let me bring you in on this, and then I promise we'll talk about the Kade Mays situation. I just wanted this to be known. Now, I get plenty of predictions wrong, but when the whole world thought that Will Muschamp was getting fired, I said months ago that I didn't think he was getting fired. I thought he'd find a way to save his job there at South Carolina. I thought that Mike Bobo was a resurrecting figure, at least in terms of employment for Will Muschamp. The presence of an elite quarterback like Gunnar Stockton would also seem to echo that point there as well. I'm not happy that Stockton committed to South Carolina, far from it. But in terms of, I kind of said that I thought Muschamp was going to hold on to that job even beyond this upcoming year. If you're pulling a big quarterback commit, that's certainly a chance to win your fans back over again after not being very good on the field these last couple of years.
Well, I would tell you that Butch Jones had the number one recruiting class going into 2017, and Taylor Martinez was a guy that everybody was and they had this 5-star. Let me tell you, they had this 5-star can't miss lineman, BA. This kid was going to revolutionize offensive line play. His name was Kade Mays. Butch Jones was so set up with a recruiting class to survive, and they'd won 9 games the year before and beat Florida and Georgia. So you would think that they got in the top 10 for the first time in over 10 years. So you thought momentum. I'm not ready to say that Muschamp keeps his job, but I think Georgia fans should root for him to keep his job, provided it doesn't involve another embarrassing, loss to South Carolina. Because with Muschamp, there's a ceiling there. He's only going to do so well.
Go ahead, Connor, then we got to move on. It's my fault.
To point a picture similar to Mike's, let's go back to 2015 if you're a Georgia fan. You had Jacob Eason committed for over a year. 5-star quarterback, most talented quarterback you would land in a long time. You think, does having Eason potentially allow you to try and hold on to Rick, even as things potentially go off the rails as they did for Georgia? And I think they might potentially go for South Carolina. Georgia ultimately decided to move on from Rick. I think in the 5 years since that, we've seen that was the correct decision to be made. I think it'll be interesting to see if something similar happens at South Carolina and whether or not Gunnar Stockton and his connection with the South Carolina staff is enough to hold Will Muschamp to that job.
It is Cover 4 Live, brought to you by Georgia Farm Bureau. I'm Brandon Adams, Jeff Sintel checking in from on the road, Mike Griffith from Athens, Connor Riley as well. We're glad to have you with us. Let's move on. And as I said before, we certainly appreciate our friends at Georgia Farm Bureau for making all of this possible. Find them online at gfbinsurance.com. That's gfbinsurance.com. It'll get you in touch with Georgia Farm Bureau. Let's move on here. Mike, I'm going to set you up to talk about this, and then we'll all kind of, join in on this. Headline-grabbing phrase used by Kade Mays' attorney, toxic environment at Georgia as a way of appealing the decision not to get immediate eligibility. I said on my show today that lawyers know how to give volatile quotes. They're ready and willing sources for reporters. I don't put a ton of stock in what any attorney says for the most part. What do you make of the, I would say, hand-to-hand combat, though, that the Mays clan seems to want to be going into with the lost waiver from the NCAA?
Well, I mean, Thomas Mars had some pretty not friendly things to say back in January too. It's curious to me. It's very curious because Cade's a guy that obviously played a lot, contributed a lot. He had plenty of opportunities to let the media know how he felt. I mean, I put videos at the bottom of the story. There's 8 or 9 videos that I think Connor could attest to this. Going back, I don't know that we saw anybody any more than we saw Kade Mays. We saw him more than we saw Jake Fromm, certainly, probably for the better in hindsight, and Swift as well. So I don't really know where the unhappiness or the toxic environment came from. I guess my big question, Brandon, is, just how ugly is this thing going to get? Because, if the Mays attorney starts to want to leak things out, well, here's why all those players were suspended for the Sugar Bowl or something like that. Kade Mays not exactly a Boy Scout during his time in Athens. I mean, I got 3 or 4 phone calls telling me, here's the reason why, here's the reason why, here's the reason why. And I'm like, wow, he did all that. So I don't know how ugly this whole thing's going to get. I think it would be better for both parties if they kind of just chilled out and let the NCAA and the SEC sort this out.
I mean, Jeff, I'm going to tell you right now that I thought Mays not being granted immediate eligibility was a just result in all of this. Hard for me to say that, at least from the outside looking in, that he was in a bad environment when he was given so much playing time, when he was a starter in his final game at Georgia. I'm sorry that he wasn't happy here, but, the idea that you're going to, the moment any adversity strikes, tuck tail and run, go to a place like Knoxville and act like it's, just free pass, fresh start. Frankly, I don't think that's what I want college football to look like. It's one thing if you're Justin Fields, you go to Columbus, Ohio. I had no problem with how he handled his transfer. But in the Mays situation, that's a little close to home not to have a good reason. I don't think I've heard a good reason yet as to why he ought to be granted immediate eligibility to play.
Yeah, Brendan, first of all, I guess we've got to be careful what we say here on this issue in case the way those lawyers' wheels are rolling right now in Knoxville, we might all get deposed to come up into this thing. But, Brendan, I don't know if I have a boilerplate theory for the way I look at this, where I try to see how the NCAA makes sense and not. Now, I'm going to grant you that what I'm about to say makes no sense in terms of the quarterback realm, because I think quarterbacks are different. Or at least it looks like the quarterbacks are different. But I've got a simple kind of paint by the numbers for a lot of these NCAA transactions. If you played a lot at the place you're leaving, you're not very likely to get immediate eligibility at the place you're going. And I think that's the NCAA looking at something and says, okay, this young man wasn't playing. Now, do we want to basically put 2 seasons of his college career in hibernation because he wasn't playing at school A and now he goes to school B, and we're going to make him sit out there another season as well? I think it could be an injuries that sometimes lead to that time, the times you're sitting. I think it could be, lack of playing time, coaching fit, or whatever. But with Kade, there's 2 really big things here. One, he played a ton at Georgia. I think he has over 18 career starts at Georgia in his first 2 seasons. And number 2, he's actually going inside the conference as well. When you try to look at a lot of things like Demetrius Robertson coming to Georgia, immediately eligible, he wasn't playing the year before, wasn't inside the conference. Demetrius Robinson was coming off of an injury, that sports hernia injury, the year before. So I think in a lot of cases, when I try to make sense about the NCAA or maybe explain it to people at a tailgate or, around a beverage or around a meal, it kind of seems to me like if you look at a lot of things, JT Daniels coming to Georgia immediately eligible. Of course, he wasn't playing there at USC the year before. You can look at a lot of cases, Tate Martell from Ohio State to Miami. He wasn't playing the year before there as well either. I'm not saying it's always perfect and symmetrical, but in a lot of cases, even Justin Fields, he wasn't the starter at Georgia. He was getting game time, and I think he played in every game his freshman year at Georgia except for the Florida game. But he really wasn't a starter, getting a lot of minutes. Luke Ford at Georgia played in a lot of ball games his freshman year, got a lot of third-team reps, got a lot of special teams reps in a lot of those games in 2018 when Georgia used to blow teams out and have second and third team personnel in there during the second and fourth quarters. That's kind of how I look at it, Brendan.
Connor, what do you think about the Mays situation?
Well, I think when you look back at his recruitment and how toxic's a funny word to use there, because there were some very hurt feelings on both sides there, and Kade rubbing salt in the wound a little bit when he picked Georgia there. I am sympathetic to a degree. I think we're seeing more and more momentum towards everyone getting a one-time transfer free or transfer ability, and I think that's a good thing. I also think that transferring in conference, he was an 18-game starter. He was very likely going to be either the right or left starting left tackle for Georgia this year. I think that all certainly factors into it, and ultimately, I'm not surprised that Mays is maybe potentially going this route where he's leaking things out. It's getting a little bit nasty because given off what we've seen in the past from him and sort of the way he's handled specifically that recruitment where he ended up picking Georgia, and it comes out that his family is now suing the University of Georgia for something that happened on his official recruiting visit. Having all that out there and be public knowledge of sorts, it's not necessarily all that surprising for Mays.
I agree with both Jeff and Connor saying the fact that he's playing so much at Georgia matters to me. Brendan Cox, when he went to Florida, I wouldn't have cared if he played last year. I don't really care that much about it. He was on his way to being surpassed in the depth chart by guys like Jermaine Johnson, Nolan Smith, and Cesar Ojulari. Anyway, I have no problem with him playing at Florida. Had he played last year, I never would have even noticed. But with Kade Mays at Tennessee, it is, I think, just a completely different situation. I want to do 2 things in this topic before we move on. What do you guys feel about and this is just, dumb social media stuff, but the rumors that are out there that somehow Kirby Smart conspired behind the scenes to prevent this from happening? Mike, what do you think about that in particular?
They didn't give him a release, and why would they? They're on the schedule. That's why I thought it was so, silly that Lane Kiffin's endorsing Kade Mays to be eligible, and they don't play Tennessee. I don't think Lane would be saying that if they played Tennessee this year. Look, the school invests so much money and time into a player. And then for him to just leave haphazardly for no reason, because his little brother wasn't good enough to play at Georgia and the dad wants him. That's probably Isaiah Wilson leaves. We're sorry you're homesick, but you're 2 years in. Georgia's invested all this money into you, into coaching you, into developing you. You're letting your entire teammates down. You're one more guy. I can see where the coach is coming from saying, I really don't want to release him to anybody, but I'm certainly not going to release him to somebody that I've got to play. And, as Jeff and Connor said, it's not like Kade, wasn't being developed or wasn't getting opportunities. It's just not that situation. So that's why they've got to create this toxic situation. I don't think it's good, BA. I think they're setting themselves up for a fall trying to pressure the NCAA and the SEC.
So let me do this, and anybody who wants to take this one can. Here's a very good player, at least on the basis of his recruiting profile. I would say that he's, had some good moments in a college uniform, but he's from like a rival hometown. He had every reason to go to Tennessee. You won that recruiting battle. I, as a fan, probably flexed over that as much as anybody did. But the first sign of adversity, he's running back home. Is it really worth it to go to a place like Knoxville and get a recruit again in the future when it's just so easy to just sour on the situation at Georgia the moment things aren't perfect? Is this a warning for future recruits? Georgia's gone to Columbia, South Carolina, and gotten recruits before. It's gone to Knoxville in the case of Kade Mays. It's gone deep in the heart of enemy territory. Is this a reason not to do that in the future?
I say no. I mean, I look at T. Higgins at Clemson. That was a guy that, if things went south. Brandon, I just don't think so. And sometimes there's a reason why you want to get kids, and kids want, Le'Veon Bell, Columbus, Ohio. Sometimes they want to get away from their hometown. Sometimes that's good if they're coming from an area or a climate where maybe they want to get away from those potential distractions, and that's why it works for them. So even if Kade gets eligible, I think it'll be really interesting to see, what happens now that he's living back in that fishbowl back home.
Jeff or Connor?
Brendan, I just don't think that's an issue. I think Kade Mays is just a perfect storm of things. Sam Pittman leaves. His brother is now enrolling as an early entry guy at Knoxville. His dad played there. Isaiah Wilson, his best friend on the team, goes pro. I think you're stacking up a lot of things that kind of convince Kade Mays that he doesn't need to be a Georgia Bulldog anymore and he needs to make a break. I think Georgia, no matter what the situation, is going to go after and go get the very best players they possibly can. If that kid's in Tuscaloosa, they're recruiting players in Tuscaloosa right now. They're recruiting players all across the country in enemy hotbeds. I mean, you saw a picture today from Georgia Football Nutrition, and it had two Bulldogs from the state of Georgia, Richard LeCount and Eric Stokes, and it had two Bulldogs from the state of California. I took a step back when I saw that. And I think, worried about enemy territory, backyards, and then running back, going back home to cozy confines. I mean, I think this is just a very unique situation. Kade Mays, volunteer captain under Philip Foreman. I think this is more of an aberration.
But I think you're kind of making my point for me. And Connor, I'm going to give you a chance to sound off on this. Isaiah Wilson alone ought not be enough to make a guy sour on an entire, team. Position coaches leave all the time. Guys leave the NFL draft all the time. I don't know how the Mays family felt about Cooper Mays' recruitment. I won't pretend to know about that. But we've seen other examples of siblings not be recruited particularly hard by Georgia, and the guy on the team at UGA seemingly doesn't really seem to be bothered by that all that much. Azeez Ojulari, I'll cite, with his brother BJ Ojulari, who just went through the recruiting process. If Cooper Mays' recruitment, if that is indeed a factor, I don't know that it is, but if Cooper Mays' recruitment, Sam Pittman's departure, Isaiah Wilson's decision to go to the NFL draft, if that's enough to make you decide, well, I don't want to be at Georgia anymore, then you weren't that closely tied to Georgia to begin with, at least not close enough for my taste.
Well, I mean, Brendan, I don't think you can have it both ways. Everybody, when celebrated Sam Pittman, they said, okay, he's the reason his batting average is so high. He gets 80% of the recruits he wants. Well, Kade Mays, I remember that recruitment with great clarity. He was going to go to Tennessee until Butch Jones and that situation unravels. And then the reason why he went to Georgia, point blank period, was because of Sam Pittman. I think in this case,
my point, Jeff. You're making my point.
I guess I am. But, for me, a lot of things went differently. But, Brendan, these are seismic changes. I mean, his younger brother goes and plays at the school where their dad was a captain. It's in the hometown. Sam Pittman's gone. One of his best friends on the Georgia team is gone. I mean, if you told anybody on the Georgia roster that we're going to take away the 4 or 5 things best you like about being a Bulldog right now, I think it would give them pause about them and transfer opportunities in the future. And a family member's going back home to play for dad's team.
Connor, final thought.
I guess my question to you, BA, and this maybe opens up more doors, but and upset's not the right word, or maybe annoyed, but do you like, or does it bother you that Kade Mays is not at Georgia anymore?
I guess a little bit, yeah. I mean, just given the fact that I feel like that Georgia had tried to do a lot for him. Certainly, I think the notion that somehow Georgia didn't do right by Kade Mays, at least publicly, what I can watch on TV or what I can see from inside the stadium, hard to imagine that. They were giving him a chance to play at virtually every single position.
Mm-hmm. I just think with my own sort of feelings on this, players I think have to necessarily – or go out of their way to look out for what they think is the best interest of themselves. And I think Kade being closer to home, being closer to family, thought that was best for him. So I'm not necessarily going to fault him for that. Sure. If the NCAA decides, hey, you have to sit out a year, that's okay. It's the NCAA's decision. I've had issues with them and the way they go about ruling on things from time to time. But I think Kade absolutely knew that was a possibility when making this decision and still made it anyway.
All I'll say as we wrap this up, go ahead, Jeff, real quick.
Yeah, I want to just add one more layer of thought to this. It's not just one brother, the one that's now at Tennessee. There's a big age gap in the Mays brothers. There's a young man that Kade is very close with. It's about 6 or 7 years old. He's in Knoxville as well. It's not just one brother, it's two. When you start adding all these up together, I kind of agree with what Connor said. To me, these young men work so hard and play so hard and invest so much in their college careers. Let them go where they're happy, especially with a one-time transfer, so they're not leapfrogging and playing Frogger all over the conference. Maybe a bylaw about conference play and rivals or something like that. But, I mean, nobody wants a player on a roster, no matter how talented he is, that doesn't want to be there.
All I'm saying is when it comes to this Mays story, there's just something about it that doesn't quite set right with me. I can't quite put my finger on what it is. All right, let's move on here and cover 4.
That's wrong, BA. That's wrong.
Come on, man. That's not cool.
You shouldn't be laughing. You shouldn't be laughing like that with that cheesy Cheshire Cat grin you got when you're making people laugh. That wasn't that good, Brandon.
I was going to move on and not even acknowledge it until Mike rolled his eyes. Then I broke character. All right, cover 4 live presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. Let's finish up with this. We've seen a lot of momentum here this week, whether it be high school football in Georgia, reaffirming its pledge to have a season, games taking place tonight in Alabama and Tennessee. The 10-game schedule announcement did a world of good for me. Next to that, you've seen the temporary pause of athletic activities at Notre Dame, UNC, a lot of criticism surrounding Big Ten Commissioner Kevin Warren for, what went into that league's decision to postpone the season. Just given everything that's happened over the last little bit, I don't want to spend a long time on this because we're getting pretty late here. I want to make some room for some comments. You guys more or less confident that the season takes place? And I guess if you're more confident, how much more confident are you now? Connor, let me begin with you on that.
I'm probably the same level of confidence in that I'm just – and again, I desperately hope that I am wrong here. And I totally understand if you guys feel differently, but I just don't know. And I still – maybe we'll push through this and – if we can get to September 26th, and I think getting to September 26th, if the teams can get to that date, I think they're going to be able to complete the season. But I just personally don't know if we can get to September 26th without stopping everything, without mass outbreaks like we've seen on Notre Dame and North Carolina's campuses happening, and that sort of slowing the progress. So my confidence level is the same, and it's just at this point in time not all that high.
Jeff, I'm actually surprised to hear you say that, Connor. Jeff, how about you?
Brandon, here's what I would say. I think the bubble situation and how it's going to happen, I think what North Carolina are doing right now, the semi-pseudo bubbles, I think the sooner that they can get to that point where remote learning happens, I think that is a crucial step. So, yeah, seeing more schools do this right now, I think it raises my, probability meter on the season. I think we get to the season and I want to see the first sudden change, the first thing where 10 players on the team have it or they have to trace something out. I think that will tell the tale about where we go with this season eventually.
Mike, how about you?
Yeah, I'd agree with Connor and Jeff. Connor, there are going to be more outbreaks. There is going to be more mask issues. There is going to be more setbacks. But, is the juice worth the squeeze? And I think the answer in the Southeastern Conference is yes, especially now that it appears the Big Ten scrambling and putting together a winter schedule. I mean, what's really going to change between now and December and January? I think the Big Ten has realized they've stepped in it in a big way. I think they're scrambling, trying to save place, maintain their players. I think it's horrible and horribly unfair that the NCAA is not letting players transfer out of schools that aren't playing football. That would have been like if Connor was at Georgia and they canceled the journalism program. I mean, he would have said, well, I'm picking up my books and going somewhere else and I'm going to put my tie on and kick some butt on cover 4 in a few years. So I got to get this degree. These football players want to play. That's why they're there. Let's stop pretending. And let's also stop pretending that you've got to have 30 people in every classroom to have a football season. There's nothing wrong with these players taking online classes. The people at LSU want to put Joe Burrow's number in their ring of fame, and he never even stepped foot on class. I don't even know if he knows how to find the Mike the Tiger cage. He played across the street from it for 2 years. So this whole concept of it has to be this way, nobody can catch it. No, it's going to be ugly. We've got to persevere. If you want something bad enough, Brandon, you know this. You got to go after it. Don't be a coward. Step up to the challenge. Take measured risks.
I will say, if teams were going to just shut down and cancel things at the first sign of positive cases, then there was no point in bringing this back at all. You had to know that was going to happen. Right. And I think the point Jeff and Mike bring up about virtual learning and making that a bubble, I've said for a while now, I think that's a necessary step that has to happen for these teams, these guys taking online classes, for that to happen. I just don't know if the NCAA and these presidents are going to have the stomach to say, okay, we're doing that and we're still going to have a football season. That's where my big hesitation comes in.
Well, the NCAA doesn't have to. We know that the NCAA doesn't cover, but the presidents, that's another matter. I would agree.
Do these presidents have the stomach to say, okay, we're not having anyone else on campus, but we're still going to have these guys sort of in their own bubble and going about and practicing and playing football? That's the big question for me that I need to see answered by these individual presidents.
So I think that football has always been a trickle-up sport more so than a trickle-down sport. Things don't start in the NFL and work their way down. They begin in high school and work their way up. I actually believe the presence of high school football in Alabama, Tennessee tonight, Georgia in a couple of weeks, Florida at some point in time, I believe the presence of high school football is going to normalize football once again. And I just think that it's going to stop people from asking questions about should this be taking place, because they're just going to see it everywhere they turn. And I think that's the appropriate thing. I'm proud of the way that high school football coaches in the state of Georgia have fought to save their sport this upcoming season. I think they deserve a lot of credit for the courage they've shown there in that regard, and the way the communities have bonded together over this kind of stuff. But the presence of high school football, I think it makes it easier for college football to go on. And frankly, the weird dichotomy of high school football taking place in Ohio while college football is not, I think the weirdness of all of that, the fact that people are asking, why is this? I just think it gives a little bit more freedom for the other Power 5 leagues, including the SEC, to do what they want to do. Here on Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau, we've kind of done our Cover 4. While we have a couple of minutes left, let's do our Cover More now and give you a chance to weigh in on both Facebook and YouTube with your comments. We'll take a couple of these on our way out the door. Christopher White brings a pretty good point. He says, what's the difference in all of this? He says, I took online classes in college. They still give you a degree for it. Kind of reminds me of my mantra in college that C's get degrees. From that standpoint, Jeff, we see this in the NCAA basketball tournament there as well. If you're one of these teams that goes on some long run in March, by the time the month begins, conference tournaments throughout really a portion of April, it's not like you're stepping foot into a college classroom. If basketball players can do that for more than a month, why can't college football players do that for a couple of months? I honestly don't understand the difference.
Yeah, it seems like I think this is a confluence, Brandon, with a lot of the academic world kind of changing. The last 4 or 5 years, remote learning, remote instruction, Zoom, like we're doing right now, it's more of a thing. I know high school kids, they sometimes get some of their instruction or they get their online classes. They do that through online as well. Mike brought up Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow was basically a professional football player, devoting an extra 20, 30 hours of his time working on LSU football, working on being the best player he could be. Same thing for Justin Fields. We remember that. He spent the whole first 6, 7, 8 months of his time in Columbus on online classes, man, once he transferred from Georgia. I think it's just another part of our world we're going to have to get used to in terms of, it's funny, everybody says C's get degrees and everything else like that. These young men are so much different than the kid walking up and down the North Avenue with a leather jacket and meeting everybody in the dorm. Or it's
that kid totally don't wear leather jackets in college anymore.
Yeah, but that's the whole Norman Rockwell painting of, they're all hanging out at the Tate Center in the middle at 12 o'clock, or the Orbit bus when they're trying to track that thing down, man. I think the preference is, and I don't know, there's a certain staff that likes to control as much as they can control. And if they can control their players and in masks and away from classrooms and away from bus stops and away from all the other things, I think they'll feel better about their season.
Hey, Jeff, DeMarco Thomas wants to know about Smile Bond. What's the latest on the 5-star linebacker?
They're getting ready to play. I think Small Munden hasn't been practicing a lot this week because he's trying to, save up for the season and rest up for the season. Most Georgia high schools are going to get going on September the 17th. It's getting closer and closer right there. But Small Munden's a guy that I kind of feel that he's going to revert back to his normal plan, which was to wait it out and take as long as possible for, maybe there's a chance that he can take some visits, or maybe there's a chance that a lot more recruiters can come by and see him and see the rest of his Paulding County teammates work.
On YouTube over here, Frank Patterson says, hey, BA, what do you guys think about all these players potentially getting a free year of eligibility? Could mean a lot of our freshmen get more playing time than just 4 games. I really believe that a school like Georgia, even if the rule does come to pass, will not likely be impacted by it all that much. Georgia already plays most of its freshmen as much as it possibly can. They'll play 20-something guys from the first-year ranks this season. I don't think this rule, if it happens, will change all that much because at Georgia, there's only so much playing time to go around as it is. And by the way, Georgia does not have a lot of guys that necessarily stick around for 5 years. So the additional year of eligibility, for the most part, I don't think really impacts Georgia players. I think it could impact an individual player, a former top recruit who's been kind of biding his time. That extra year may give him a chance to get on the field where he maybe hasn't had that chance as of yet. But, Mike, for the most part, I don't think if the NCAA adopts this rule, if it truly becomes a thing, I think schools like Georgia are impacted very little by this.
I think it's a desperate stab by the NCAA to be relevant and try and do something good for the student athlete after they've made some bad decisions and their leadership isn't questioned.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, Mike. It feels like pandering more so than any kind of significant thing because on the other side of the food chain, the smaller schools can't afford the extra scholarship load when it comes to the financial part of this as it is. A couple more comments here as we're going Cover 4 Live, Cover More now, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau.
Brandon, you could
Go ahead.
You could see Kirby Smart bring in like 9 graduate transfer kickers and other positions for the 2020 cycle because that's a free year and you get a graduate transfer. They're not going anywhere. You won't have to pay for that. Georgia might corner the market with graduate transfers if that passes.
That is exactly right, Jeff. I think that's a pretty good point. By the way, A.J. Hendricks checking in. He's a high school coach in the state of Georgia. Connor, I love these high school coaches, the work they do for our state. It's one of the things that made Javon Bullard's commitment this week so much fun. When you see these guys that get their chance to play at Georgia because of the work that's done by the, what I would say, very impressive crop of coaches in our state, I think it's one of the great resources that we have here in Georgia.
Yeah, and I'll be interested to see. I know some parts of the state are on different sort of timelines as far as college or seasons going forward. There's games that'll be played in the next couple of weeks, and then I know Fulton County, where I'm from, they've said no games until at least, I believe, September 14th or September 17th. So it'll be very interesting to sort of see, and I believe either Jeff or you were the one who made the point of how high school football goes going forward. I do think that could be a potential blueprint in seeing how it plays out at the SEC level this fall.
All right, we've taken up too much of everybody's time as it is. I've taken a lot of y'all's time as well. Final thought from anybody before we go here? Anybody that didn't get to say anything that they want to say?
Everybody's got a plan till they get punched in the mouth.
Mike Tyson.
Or get COVID.
Brandon,
all the talk about the Georgia offense and how great it is. I want to hear how great it is after the first padded scrimmage.
Well, to be fair, though, what I'm hearing compliments on right now is not how great the offense is, but how well the instruction part of this is going. And, Mike, I do think that's really important.
And to piggyback off of that, we were all saying, how great things were under James Coley a year ago, and that just proved to flat out not be the case.
Wait a minute. What do you mean? They won the Sugar Bowl. I'm just kidding.
Jeff, how about you? Final thought from you?
Brandon, I'll be preparing for your 19 questions about MJ Morris tomorrow on Dog Nation Daily. Great football player Gunnar Stockton's going to South Carolina. That will be a very interesting addition. Carolina's got some quarterbacks, though. I mean, they got a good guy in the 2020 cycle as well. They got Ryan Helinski there as well. They brought in a transfer from South Carolina, brought in a transfer from Colorado State, which was the starter with Mike Bobo. He's going to know that offense. Might have some jumbled up depth chart questions over there in Carolina on their own right about having too many quarterbacks with lots of eligibility too.
Tomorrow's a fun day around Dog Nation. In addition to Jeff Sintel's appearance on Dog Nation Daily, we've also got a chance to hear from Georgia defensive coordinator Dan Lanning coming up. He'll have some interesting things to say as he tries to put a big stamp on a Georgia team this year that could be led by a truly special defense. Lanning, I'm sure, will have some really interesting things to say about that. A sharp young coach, a chance to profile him tomorrow. Should be a lot of fun. Mike Griffith, Connor Riley will have all kinds of coverage of that. Jeff Sintel on the recruiting front. And as Jeff was nice enough to say, I'll see you tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for Dog Nation Daily. But for now, on behalf of all those guys, let me say thanks to you for being a part of Cover 4 Live, presented by Georgia Farm Bureau. We'll see you again here next Thursday night, and hope you get ready to enjoy a great weekend, everybody.